continuing our coverage of events in this alternate Trump as president timeline. Our next guest has been covering several of the interesting legal stories of the past couple weeks. Mark Joseph Stern writes for Slate and specializes in legal and LGBTQ issues. Mark, thanks for coming on the program.
Thanks so much for having me on.
So let's start with this. In an event-filled week, Donald Trump signs an executive order denying entry to even green card holding immigrants from 7 countries, and chaos ensues at America's airports. You were at Dulles Airport, correct?
That's correct.
So basically, tell us what you saw when you were there. You know, the reporting, including yours, some of the reporting was very, very good. But give us a sense of the scene, the environment. You had protesters, you had people trying to get in, you had attorneys trying to represent the people being denied entry, and then you had the immigration folks themselves, the government employees. So what was the general atmosphere?
Well, it was mayhem. It was absolutely chaos at Dulles. You know, there were dozens of attorneys all huddled around tables on the floor trying to write up habeas petitions for these people who were being detained by Customs and Border Protection agents. There were hundreds of protesters all forming a line around the exit of the customs area at Dulles. And then there were dozens of police officers near the protesters to ensure they stayed in their place and to allow travelers to exit. Now, interestingly, we did not see any Customs and Border Protection officers ourselves because they stayed behind the big locked double doors, and they used regular police officers as their intermediaries through which to send and receive messages. Customs and Border Protection did not wish to interact with anyone at the airport except the officers, including the attorneys who were attempting to represent a lot of the people who were traveling through Dulles and potentially getting detained.
So first of all, the journalistic side of my personality, when you describe that scene, perversely says, sounds like fun, actually. It sounds like an exciting scene. And of course, it was not fun for the people being denied entry, and it's a deadly serious matter. But when I'm trying to get my hands around the legal issues here, Mark. So when the immigration officers refused to have contact with the attorneys involved, were they in violation of any laws or court orders or anything of that kind?
Yes. So every judge who has heard these issues so far has ruled at a minimum that the detention and deportation of people trapped by the executive order who were in the United States or on their way to the United States when the order was signed violates their due process rights. And in addition, a federal judge in Virginia ruled that Customs and Border Protection agents could not lawfully deny those detainees access to attorneys. As I said, there were dozens of attorneys trying to represent these people who were trapped by the ban. You know, they are completely lawful immigrants, visa holders, green card holders, but because of this executive order, their presence in the U.S. had become unlawful. Attorneys were trying to represent them. They got a court order saying they had that right, that these people had to be given access to these attorneys. And even then, Customs and Border Protection officers did not give them access. So it's pretty clear that for at least a few lawless hours over the weekend, CBP was violating a court order, and we were sort of teetering on the brink of a constitutional crisis.
Now, it's so interesting, and it's so important, I think, to get the details right on this. You have to assume that all of these border protection, Customs and Border Protection officers were not randomly and independently coming up with this idea. We have to, I don't know if we know this for a fact, but you have to assume they were under orders not to comply with the court's instructions, right?
Yes, it seems to me that what they were told is we are an executive police force. We are part of the executive branch, and we follow orders from the president. And anyone who tells us something that isn't the president has no right to tell us that. We should not follow that command if it conflicts with what the president has told us. And we know that Customs and Border Protection officers literally told detained immigrants and refugees, we aren't going to let you through because of Donald Trump. If you have a problem with this, talk to Mr. Trump. We're doing this because of Mr. Trump. So it was almost as though CBP was the personal law enforcement arm of Donald Trump himself, that they somehow operated a little bit outside of our regular legal system, and that they didn't feel compelled to comply with these court orders because even though they came from the judiciary, they didn't come from Donald Trump.
Well, that doesn't, I don't want to lead the witness here, but that doesn't sound terribly American to me.
No, it did not seem terribly American to me. The scene that I saw at Dulles was extraordinarily distressing. I spoke with one woman who was detained for about 2 hours. A full day after Dulles Customs and Border Protection officers said they were no longer detaining people under the ban. This woman was detained for 2 hours, questioned heavily. She was a German national who had renounced her Iraqi citizenship, and yet she was held, asked about her loyalties, her children, her family, her money, her beliefs, and then told it was all being done because of Donald Trump. That's really un-American to my mind. The president is the president, but we have rule of law for a reason. These guys were going as far as they could beyond the court order without, I guess, technically breaking it. And it was pretty sleazy to watch.
Yeah, I mean, I think sleazy is an operative word, too. And in our system, we're not just an executive form of government. We have a legislative and judiciary branch, too, which apparently seems to have escaped our attention. Now, let me ask you another question. And again, we're talking with Mark Joseph Stern from Slate. Mark, it seems as if maybe the police officers had an obligation here, too, to I could be wrong, but were the police officers were acting as messengers and not giving the lawyers access to their clients. Were they in any way not doing what they should have done given the court order, or is that out of bounds for me to suggest that?
Well, I think it's a bit trickier with them. They were sort of caught in the middle. Far be it from me to just blindly defend law enforcement officers, but I do think that they were trapped between two different factions. Customs and Border Protection told them in no uncertain terms, let no one through. And yet you had lawyers waving this court order saying, we get to go through. The point that really distressed me the most was when Congress people and senators showed up. Cory Booker showed up at the airport and said, I am a senator of the United States. I see a court order requiring you to let me and these attorneys speak to these detainees. Please let me through. And the law enforcement officer said, we can't do that. We have orders not to let you through. That's pretty disturbing. That seems like the kind of thing that happens in a banana republic, not a developed country.
Yeah, and who gave the orders, by the way, not to let him through? I mean, the border protection folks don't have jurisdiction over the Port Authority or local police. Where did those orders come from? I'd like to know that. Do we know?
Well, we don't know yet, but I think that presuming there is an investigation, which I think there should be and hopefully will be, we'll get a little more information about who was sitting at the top telling CBP to do these frankly lawless things. We don't know what the chain of command looked like. They have shrouded themselves in mystery. Very few of them will talk to anyone, not lawyers, not the press, not Congress people. And so we don't know the answers yet. But this is the kind of thing that I think people who are upset about this crisis over the weekend really need to press for, even as the initial crisis fades. How did this happen? How was it that CBP was able to operate outside of the law for so long?
I think that's a really important point, that even though the crisis has passed, we need to keep pressing it. I'd also like to know, Mark, who gave the police the orders not to allow senators or attorneys through, because they don't take orders from the CBP. So do we know where that order came from?
No, we don't, but there's a lot of aggression, rightfully so, in the Virginia federal court right now, forcing CBP and all players involved over the weekend to explain why they shouldn't be held in contempt of court for violating these orders. The state of Virginia has gotten involved. The state's excellent Attorney General, Mark Herring, is pushing in court to get some answers. So perhaps this is an issue that we'll have a better grasp on in the coming days and weeks.
So okay, and let's take it a step forward. So the ACLU steps in. We get this ban. Now it appears the crisis is temporarily averted, except that we keep hearing stories about abuses of power, people not getting on planes. I didn't get a chance to read it in detail, but I saw a headline this morning suggesting that someone with a student visa, a physician, was not allowed back in the U.S. At his point of embarkation because they found a Muslim prayer app on his iPhone or something. I mean, is there still first of all, is there still a lingering abuse going on?
Oh, I think there's no doubt that CBP officers and others involved in this process are taking the spirit of the order, which itself was malicious and discriminatory, and just extending it far beyond what even the text said. We're seeing CBP detaining and questioning and deporting and denying entry to people who aren't even on the list of countries covered, who aren't refugees, who are lawful permanent residents, green card holders, visa holders, just because they seem suspicious. It's almost as though CBP has taken this post 9/11 vibe and used it as pretext to just crack down on a border patrol in a very unlawful way. So yes, I think the crisis has passed in the sense that hundreds of people are not being illegally detained at airports right now. It's not hundreds, and the detention is not nearly as extreme. But they are still abusing their power. They are still going beyond what these court orders require. And so I think that the pressure needs to stay on high. We still need to keep holding these guys accountable because they are not implementing the law. They are still following the parts of the order that have been invalidated. And it's just not clear whether they'll ever stop or whether this is the beginning of a new kind of border patrol that's frankly kind of terrifying.
Well, it is terrifying, and it makes me wonder whether there was always this sort of simmering hostility toward a certain kind of immigrant, a Muslim immigrant, lurking in the CBP, waiting for someone like Trump to unleash it, or whether they're getting affirmative orders to do this, or whether it's a mixture of all the above. I'm asking you to speculate a little bit, which is kind of unfair for a journalist, but any sense of that?
You know, I don't know what's in CBP officers' hearts,
right,
but I know from being on the ground that they were unusually and notably eager to implement this order in a way that clearly targeted people from Muslim majority countries and seemed to disparately impact Muslims themselves. If you just look at what happened as soon as this order came down, it was as though the order might as well have just said, Muslims are out, no more Muslims. We have to screen them way more than anyone else, and if we can, send them back from whence they came. So, you know, again, I don't know what's in their hearts. I don't know who's behind all of this necessarily, aside from Trump and his advisors at the top, but it does seem like they were disturbingly eager to implement this in a discriminatory way.
Yeah, disturbing is the word. And last question, you and Dahlia Lithwick and Leon Nafak did a kind of dialogue on what might happen in Slate about what might happen if Donald Trump refused a federal court order. Is that a possibility, you think?
Oh, certainly. I mean, we already know that CBP officers denied the existence of one for several hours. I don't think it's at all unreasonable to speculate that Trump himself or a branch of the executive might just deny the existence of a court order, refuse to comply with it. And so Dahlia, Leon, and I asked a ton of experts what happens then, and no one really knows. You know, the clearest modern precedent here is Little Rock, but that was state officials refusing to comply with a federal court order. Here, the question is what happens when one part of the federal government won't comply with the order of another, which has supremacy? And we don't know the answer. The clearest solution would be to send in federal marshals to implement the order, but that would really, in practice, involve an armed conflict between federal marshals sent by the court and CBP officials. Again, the kind of thing that happens in a banana republic, hopefully not the US, and it's a very sort of dystopian view of what could be coming down the pike.
That's for sure. And so, listen, we'll keep watching and we'll keep reading you. And we don't know what's going to happen next, but it is certainly dystopian and unprecedented, or unprecedented and potentially dystopian. So, Mark Joseph Stern of Slate, thanks for covering these stories and thanks for coming on the program.
Thanks so much for having me on.